Okay, today to go along with Chapter 8, Campaigns and Elections, I wanted to add the five-step process of the presidential election. I think all these chapters are really difficult when you're writing a textbook like this because you've got so much information to pack into one chapter. As I said before during the semester, some of these chapters are entire classes, and this is a class that you often see in political. We don't have the specific class at BYU Idaho, but a lot of places they have an elections and campaigns class. We try to incorporate it into our political parties and interest groups class. So I think it's a bit challenging to try to figure out, what are we going to put in here? And I thought the chapter did a really good job of touching broadly on the different issues of elections and who votes and campaign finance and how congressional and presidential candidates advertise and try to get elected. This is probably the one thing that I would add, and so that's why I'm choosing to talk with you all about it today. So, this is specifically true of the presidential election, but some of these steps can be applied to other types of elections. Congress has a lot of similarities with the presidential election process. They don't have a national nominating convention, but they have these 4 other steps that I'm going to be talking about. So the 5-step process for presidential elections, and it's really neat because we're going through it right now, so we can see it firsthand. We have an election coming up in the fall. The primaries are happening right now, and they're not done yet. So we can observe how it's happening in real time. So the 5 steps are, and I'm going to talk about each of them briefly, is that the candidates will assess their chances of winning and before they enter the race. Then they will enter the race. That's the second step. Then you have the primaries and caucuses. Then you have the national nominating convention and the general election. I'm going to focus my comments a little bit towards the Democrats. There is, just because that's the competitive, or was the competitive, Biden's obviously the winner now, but as everybody else has dropped out and conceded, but they're the ones that are actually running a competitive primary season this time because we have an incumbent president. And one thing people forget is there actually have been Republican primaries and caucuses that are going on, but it's a foregone conclusion in the modern era that the incumbent president will get that nomination. So typically you don't see, and it's true this time, you don't see real strong candidates going up against an incumbent president. So it's happening, but not really being reported on too much. And the main focus is on what's happening with the Democrats. So in this first step, you need to decide, and I'll kind of work down through these notes in discussing this. You need to decide what's important. We're over $1 billion spent in presidential elections now, so that's quite a bit of money. So on each side, you'll have upwards of $1 billion spent to try to win that general election. So that's quite a bit of money. You've either got to have the money, some of the money yourself to campaign with, or you've got to be able to raise that type of money, and that takes things like name recognition, a background where people know you, an organizational help from the Democrats or the Republicans, and all that. So it can be daunting, and that's why we've set up a system. I think one of the flaws with our system now, and you guys read about it, there is public money, and the public money is to help people run for president that aren't kind of your normal people these days. But it's not enough money to win. You can't win, so you have to be kind of an elite to even consider running for president to raise the kinds of money that you're going to need to do that. So you see people like a Donald Trump, who didn't have a political background, but had a big long business background, has been tied at different times to both parties. He was a Democrat for a long time, then he switched to the Republican Party, but has strong ties and was able to use some of his own money and raise money. Barack Obama, the previous president, who was a well-known political figure coming from Chicago and an up-and-coming candidate in the Senate, and was able to get that money through the through recognition and the help of others in the Democratic Party and all that. So you've got to be able to get that money, and then you also need an overall plan. What's the story you're running on? Why are you running? For Trump, Trump's messaging is very clear. His idea is make America great again. So the slogan, and it's a slogan that has worked really well for him. For Obama, it was change. So you see these different slogans and themes in campaigns, and then the organization. I mentioned the Democrats and the Republicans, getting behind you. Other, campaign organizations, whether they be PACs, 527 groups, 501c4s, some of the other groups that were mentioned in the chapter, they can independently, the campaign rules, PACs can give money directly to candidates, but some of these other groups like 527 super PACs, they can spend independent money running election advertising for these candidates. Okay. I mentioned here the exploratory committee right here. That's a term that you see it allows people that are running for office, and in this case, for the presidency, they set up this committee, and then they can raise money for their run for the presidency. So you'll see a lot of times people will set up these exploratory committees before they've even announced that they're going to run. That is a signal to us that there's a strong likelihood that they'll probably run for president. It's a very long system that we have now, and it starts again in kind of we're still in the assess your chances category, but it starts with what we call the invisible primary. So that's the primary you're actually running, getting some more name recognition, going on press tours, visiting states, and this all starts about 2.5 years in advance of the general election. So, a president isn't in there very long when they already have to kind of think about re-election, or a challenger is, starting to think about, or challengers, of course, are starting to think about running against that president. You should enter the race pretty early. It's getting, if I mentioned that, the invisible primary is 2.5 years in advance of the general election, you've got to be gearing up at this point, or at least thinking about it, or you just don't have a chance. You can't really enter once the primary season has started, basically 9 months out from the general election. You just don't have a chance of getting the attention and getting the money and the organization and the themes and all that ready for the election. One of the things in the last couple of elections that you all have probably noticed, and it's becoming institutionalized now, that I think we're gonna see it in the future, is this process of Democrats, or first it was the Republicans, right, and then the Democrats this time, having these debates that happen well into the summer, about a year and 3 months before the general election, and all these people on the debate stage, and a series of these debates, and trying to kind of weed out candidates before you even get to the primaries and caucuses. So that's that institutionalizing of that debate process has made this even kind of longer. So I think for a lot of people it gets a bit tiring. For us political junkies, we love to watch all this, and it's fun and all that, but it does kind of wear out the American public. So I guess the minimum, you got to be in on those debates now. I just don't see a way of not being in on those debates. So whenever those debates are happening, you probably need to be in those debates. If not, I think you're going to find it very difficult at the latest, the very, very latest, at least a year in advance of the general election, but you're going to be sorely hurt if you don't get in as early as possible. So now you've officially entered the race. People will make different kinds of announcements. They've got their teams. This is stage 2. They've got their teams put together. They'll start going certain places. Where are they going to be going? Well, Iowa, the first caucus, New Hampshire, the first primary, the Super Tuesday states. Those are that's the day when there's a big election in the primary season, where it's important to do well in order to win. You're going to see them visiting those places. You're going to see them talking with different important figures in in politics to gain awareness for their campaign. Nowadays you're going to have your social media all ready to go, the different kind of, Facebook and your Twitter and your Instagram and everything just honed in, and get your advertising starting to go. So that's what you're basically doing once you've entered the race. In the third step, the primaries and caucuses. So really quickly, some definitions, and the book's done a pretty good job of defining these, but quickly again, primary is just a regular election where you actually go vote in the state for the candidate. In this case, we're talking about the presidential candidate that you want. A caucus, you're also counting, but it's more of a meeting. So you go and there's a meeting of people, and they figure out a way to kind of count up those votes. But it's not just go into a booth and mark a piece of paper. So for example, if I went to a caucus meeting, in maybe Eastern Idaho, I would go over to this high school, and there'd be either a group of Republicans or Democrats, and I'd get there and they'd say, okay, we have 4 candidates, and why don't you go to the right corner if you're for candidate A, and maybe the left corner for candidate B and C and D likewise. And then they'll see kind of where everyone's at. Then there'll be some speeches and some cajoling and trying to influence. And then people will move a little bit, and there's typically refreshments and things. And then at the end of the meeting, they will count up the votes, either like hand count them, or sometimes they'll give you things like a little coin or a rock or something. It's like the ancient Athenians, to count up the vote. But then you take those numbers from each of the meetings in the state, and that gets you the total to figure out who's won the caucus for that state. The parties, either Democrats or Republicans, choose whether they want to have primaries or caucuses, and they also, here's the other terms, they also choose whether those are open or closed. Somebody in one of the, I don't remember which section it was, but asked a really great question about why they were having difficulty voting. I'm trying to remember the specifics, but I think it was they couldn't vote in the Republican primary because they were a registered independent, but they could vote in the Democratic, either caucus or primary. Well, it was a wonderful story, because it really lays out how this works. If it's a closed primary or caucus, only people who are registered in that party can vote. If it's open, anybody can vote. Obviously, the parties, if the parties in general kind of prefer closed, sometimes they keep them open. One of the difficulties with open elections is, I'll come back to this map in just a second, is that you get what are known as problems of rating and crossing over. So crossing over is more of a benevolent term, where let's say I'm a Republican, but there's an open Democratic primary. I don't have to register as a Democrat to vote in that, and I maybe benevolently want to, like, I have some thoughts about who I want to be the Democratic nominee for that state, and I'm not doing it in a bad way. I just want to go vote, right? That's crossing over. Rating is when you specifically go to an open primary or caucus to cause problems. So one way to do this would be get a bunch of people, go to an open primary caucus, and vote for the worst candidate in order to try to influence that election. So some things you've got to be aware of if you do have an open primary or caucus, some problems. So this is actually the schedule here of how this primary season runs. Again, the key thing to remember with elections is that it's one of the processes that the party controls. So the national party helps schedule, and well, states are responsible for scheduling, but the national party has some influence in terms of when these are scheduled. And then there's tradition involved. For example, Iowa is always the first caucus. New Hampshire has traditionally been the first primary. The Super Tuesday states have been the Super Tuesday states for a while. One of the things that has been happening is over the years is this idea of front loading. So the process typically runs from early January to July. And the front loading is moving your state's primary or caucus up earlier in the election season so that you can have more influence instead of having it at the end. So a lot of front-loading movements, some pushback, particularly in not this election season, but the one that I think the two before, a lot of pushback from the national party apparatus to punish states who move their primaries or caucuses up too soon, and they didn't like that, and actually took away some of their delegates. Of course, as you read, the goal here is to get the majority of the delegates, and again, we're going to focus on the Democrats because that's the competitive race. So get the majority of the delegates, and if I get, more the 50+1 delegates, the Democrats have a few thousand, but you got to get 50% plus one, and you win the nomination, right? So each state has delegates. The delegates are calculated based on the electoral college vote in that state. So the bigger states have more delegates. And then they also get more delegates if they are, in this case, dark blue states rather than leaning blue Democratic states or swing states. And traditionally, so they go back and look at, has your state been a Democratic state for a long time? You're going to have more votes mathematically than maybe some other states. But the biggest factor is the size of your state as well. So you have delegates, and then to make matters even a little more complicated, they also have superdelegates. Democrats have quite a few of these, and Republicans don't have very many. But a superdelegate is you're giving party insiders basically a vote. So it's just like if they were a delegate, they get their own special vote. So someone like a Bill Clinton would be a superdelegate. He has a vote at the national convention. So add all that up again, 50+1, you win the nomination. We're in that process right now. Joe Biden has won, and this shows kind of the colors here. So you have in February, what was interesting this year is that the primaries and caucuses were actually condensed a little bit and didn't start in January, which has been a trend to move them up sooner and sooner. In fact, for years I've been talking about the potential of primaries and caucuses moving into the year before, like a December, early December, November, and the opposite kind of happened where they said, okay, we're not going to have them in January. I bet they wish they had started early now because of coronavirus, but nonetheless, they were in February. The red states were in February. Then you see the orange, were some orange states here, March 3rd. So these are like the Super Tuesday states. Yellow's March 10, so Idaho is actually on that one. Green, March 14th through 17th, so a ton in March, right? And then you have light blue in April. I forgot to put, this is May. This is supposed to be, yeah, light blues in April, and then light purple is in May. So you see a few light purple states. And then you have the dark purple right here. Or sorry, that's light purple. Dark purple right here. These states, June and August, haven't gone yet. So everyone thinks it's done, but it's not done. So we still have a few to go. It's kind of a foregone conclusion now that everybody's dropped out. He's gonna win the nomination. But your last state to go for the Democrats is actually Connecticut on August 11th, and then they're going to have the Democratic National Convention August 17th through the 20th. So that's the process. I'm trying to get more delegates, super delegates, than the other people running for president. It's a difficult process. It's time consuming. There's lots of debates even before you get into this process, and then debates during, and campaigning in all these different states, and raising money and getting on ballots and all that. And it's a pretty good test for, endurance test kind of for, I don't think our elections are necessarily tell us who's going to be the best president, but it does tell us something about energy level and endurance and all that. Okay, we talked about front loading. We talked about early money and making sure you have more money. The book touched on this a little bit, who's voting in these primaries. Typically people that are more geared towards politics. Actually, with some of the one blessing from COVID-19 in terms of elections has been voter turnout has been skyrocketed because, well, some of these primaries had to get rescheduled, and caucuses had to get rescheduled and were canceled, and in other places you see skyrocketing numbers because of mail-in ballots. Anytime you make it easier to vote, more people are going to vote. So that's been kind of fun to watch. Lots of people voting. I mean, I'll put these notes up for you on Canvas. These voters are typically affected by momentum, bandwagon effects. They look at personal characteristics in the primaries a lot. Okay, so our fourth step is the national conventions, and that's going to happen this summer. Both the Republicans and the Democrats. For the Republicans, it's really just a stage for, getting some momentum behind Trump and formally saying, hey, we want you to be our candidate again. So for the Democrats, it's actually physically nominating that candidate. So you'll see, if you've watched this on TV before, you'll see them hold up signs and actually formally vote for the candidate and award him or her the nomination. They'll kind of solidify and approve the platform going forward. What are we going to be focused on? There'll be speeches and important figures giving speeches there and kind of getting that going. You see momentum building towards the fall for the general election. And then one of the big things is you usually get a vice presidential candidate coming out of that. It's a good place to announce and show them on stage who your vice presidential candidate's going to be. In the last stage, so now we're the 3 months, you're talking September, October, November, that one of the big things here is you're going to have the formal debates between the two final candidates. So this would be some debates between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Usually there's around, at least three important debates. That can vary. The Presidential Debate Commission was founded in the 70s by the two major political parties, and they kind of work out the rules of how those debates work and when they happen and all of that and who can participate. Generally, third-party candidates aren't allowed to participate because of the rules. You have to have quite a bit of momentum before you can get on the debate stage. The last person we saw was almost 30 years ago, Ross Perot in the presidential debates. Okay, so more money coming in, lots of campaign advertising, obviously some positive ads, lots of negative ads as well. I think there's lots more dynamics in the type of advertising we're seeing now as social media has come into the process. That, in terms of presidential elections, Barack Obama was kind of the one that sort of, not that there weren't websites and things before in presidential elections, but he was the one that really kind of solidified and showed everyone how to really do it with social media. And lots of people wrote books and articles about the Obama social media campaigns for presidency twice. So we're at a high level there now. Both parties are doing things that are very sophisticated in terms of social media and algorithms and identifying people's voting preferences based on all kinds of things like where do they shop and where do they live and what are their favorite books and movies and things like that. So it's pretty fascinating, and also some controversy around that with, if you were following the Cambridge Analytica scandal that happened. Some interesting things going on. Okay, so the Electoral College real quick. Most of you have a pretty good feel for that, but the basics are you need 270 votes to win. In fact, I have an activity for you today where you're going to be looking at a website called 270 to Win, and you're going to go in there and see kind of what they're predicting right now, do some analysis in terms of polling for the swing states, and then go back to the website and finish your map to see who you think is going to win the presidency in the fall. But you have, basically how it works is you have 435 representatives in the House. You have 100 senators, that's 535. and then you have 3 votes to the District of Columbia, even though they don't have representatives, and that total is 538. So in order to win the election, you have to have a majority of those, and that is 270. Everyone always asks this question: what happens if there's no 270? Really interesting process. We don't want to do that. But it goes to the House for the president, and the House votes to figure that out. And for the vice president, it goes to the Senate. So you could get some kind of fun things depending on the political dynamic. You could have a scenario where you get a president. We don't want this scenario, by the way, but you could get let's say it went to the House because somebody didn't get 270, and Trump, or sorry, it would be the opposite, right? So it goes to the House because nobody gets 270, and out of the House you get Biden, and then the Senate, which is Republican right now, could come with a conservative, vice president or something to be in that ticket. So you could have a president of one party and a vice president of another party. So that could be crazy, right? You could write a novel on that. So anyways, it's winner take all, and except in Maine and Nebraska. You'll see that on the map when you go to 270 to win, and you're trying to get to 270. So it's just based on the process is based on your how many senators you have, and how many representatives you have. So like in a state like Idaho, we have 2 reps, 2 senators. And so our vote is, we get 4 electoral college votes. Republicans typically win in Idaho. So if you get a majority of the votes, you win Idaho. And then there's actual electors who are picked by the parties. So the 4 Republican electors would go to the electoral college and cast those 4 votes. They typically just vote for the party, and it's never an issue. Occasionally we have what are called faithless electors, and these are people that should have voted for the candidate because they were either Republican or Democrat, and then they switch their vote. And in some states, they're constitutionally bound to vote for the candidate from the party that the electors were elected from. But it's not unusual to get maybe 5 or so faithless electors each election or something like that. Upwards of 5, it can happen. Sometimes there's not any of it. You can have some rogue electors. So that's sort of the process. In the primary, I didn't mention this in the primaries and caucuses, but one of the things that I like about that system is that you see a lot of states approving proportional voting, which is much more democratic. You can avoid problems that we're seeing it more often now, and we could actually see it again. If Trump wins again, I wouldn't be surprised if he lost the popular vote again and still won in the electoral college. So that would be 3 times in 20 years, because it happened in the Bush-Gore race in 2000. So yeah, it's happening more frequently, and I think that's one of the criticisms that's happened, that people are talking about more with the electoral college and the system that we have. I'd like to see that switch to maybe proportional. So in a state like Idaho, let's say the Democrat got 25% of the vote, the Republicans got 75% of the vote, then you would just give 3 electors to the Republicans and 1 elector to the Democrats. And then Democrats in basically essentially one party states where certain parties dominate would feel better about their vote. Anyways, that's the 5 steps of the presidential nomination process. Hopefully that was helpful in thinking about the system and how it works and what you can expect in presidential elections.